Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey there, and welcome to episode 114 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and today, Holly and I are talking with a guest, Gena McCown. Now, in this episode, Gena is sharing with us about her leadership journey, which includes transitioning from the marketplace to the church world, and she is very honest about the challenges that she faced in that transition. We also discuss what to do when your gifts are not recognized or valued in your church, navigating volunteer leadership, and leading with a chronic illness. There is so much packed into this episode, and I don't want you to miss any of it. So it's going to be insightful, fun, and sometimes challenging, but I know you're going to benefit from hearing what Gena has to share. We even had a piece of this conversation that I couldn't fit in the episode because we just couldn't stop talking. And this conversation was all about women's ministry. And so that is actually going to be added to our bonus podcast for supporters. Now, if you haven't heard me mention this before, we have a bonus podcast feed for anyone who chooses to support us as a podcast. And you can get that information right in the show notes. You can click the link. It will take you right to the place where you can support the podcast for just $5 a month. And that will allow you to get a bonus podcast feed where there are additional conversations that we don't include in this main podcast. You can also go to estherlittlefield.com/support to sign up there. Now, Gena is an active member of our Purposeful Leadership Facebook group. She's a native South Floridian. She's been married for 22 years and has 3 daughters. She serves in her church as a women's ministry leader, and she also has written a book called Women's Ministry with Purpose, a gospel-centered approach. So be sure to check that out. Again, we'll have the notes for that, the link for that in the show notes. But in addition to serving in her local church, Gena also teaches a college course on women's ministry. She founded the Women's Ministry Council to provide practical ministry training to women called in leadership. So you can see that Gena has a wealth of experience and knowledge to share with you in this conversation. So I'm excited for you to listen. You can get the show notes for this episode at estherlittlefield.com/episode 114. And this episode is brought to you by my program, The Confident Leader Catalyst. The Confident Leader Catalyst will help you step out of your comfort zone and into your calling with confidence, clarity, and courage. So when you're listening to this, the program may or may not be open depending on when you're hearing this, but I do have a free quiz for you that can help you at any point in your leadership journey to take your next steps to becoming a confident leader. So you can check that out at estherlittlefield.com/leader quiz. And you will also find the links for all of these things, again, in the show notes for this episode. So let's dive in to our conversation with Gena McCown. Well, welcome, Gena, to the show. We are so glad to have you with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So, Gena, while we are getting started, can you tell us a little bit about what your life and leadership looks like right now?
Right now, my life and leadership is crazy. I somehow, we're recording this kind of in the midst of the COVID-19 where we're starting to kind of get back to normal. And for some crazy idea, we also thought this was like the great time to buy a house. So my life is literally nuts. yet I'm watching God work in so many amazing and great ways. And that's so very cool. But for leadership, it's a really interesting time because for leaders, we are being pressed into new territory and we're having to do things differently. I know for me, there are some things that like I'm a really quick adapter to, like, yes, let's go change and something new and something wonderful. But in the world of technology, I'm a slow adapter. And so the idea of, taking some of our ministry work and going online, I've always kind of put it off because that would require learning new technology, buying equipment, doing all of these things that sound so big and so expensive. Well, this time period threw us into work with what you got. And you don't have time to go and buy this stuff. And you don't have time to go and learn new, fancy equipment and software. Instead, what do you have available to you? How can you use it to maximize continuing your ministry in a time where, we've lost access to our buildings and all of the fancy stuff, even that we maybe had there. We're production studios in our own living rooms. And so it actually forced me to kind of not hold on to those excuses anymore and to really embrace what is available out there. And what we're finding is that there are tons of opportunities out there to do things online. Our cameras on our phones are just as great. Our laptop cameras are just as fantastic, especially nowadays versus 10, 15 years ago. And there's free software out there. So everything that we've made it so hard to jump on board with is actually quite easier than we anticipated it would be. And I think we've watched not only just leaders in general, but I can speak for myself. I've watched myself adapt very quickly and utilize what's already out there. And it's actually turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it would be. I think people have a lot of grace too right now, though. They also understand we're all adapting to new technology. And so their expectations may be really low. And I'm okay with that.
So could you tell us specifically what your roles are, what your actual leadership roles look like right now?
So in my local church, I am a women's ministry director. I also serve in some other capacities in there because I think we all know that particularly for women serving in the church, we tend to be kind of a multi-hat person. So while I lead the women's ministry, I also serve like on our Next Step team and I, as a prayer leader, things like that, small group leader. But then within the community, I have a ministry that we started here intending to be locally, and it's actually branched out now to include much more, where we provide free leadership training to women who are in ministry leadership positions or where they feel like they're being called into that. Because we recognize that there was really a gap in the material that was out there for women, by women, about how women lead in ministry and in the church. And we wanted to really kind of get in there and answer that question of like, how do I do this? So many women that are leading in the church, they're college educated and, they work in Fortune 500 companies or they're teaching and professors or, anything like that, which is fantastic and wonderful. But they've never had somebody who sat down with them when they said, yes, I'll volunteer to lead that ministry and say, okay, well, here's how you write a ministry budget. And, here's how you have effective conversations with your pastor. And here's how you develop leaders within the church, because it is very different. And coming from myself, having a background in secular management to leading in the church, I really had to learn that on my own. Navigate those waters and hit the bumps and get the bruises and make a million mistakes to realize how different it really is.
Yeah. So needed. So needed.
Yes.
So if you could rewind back just a little bit and talk to us about your leadership journey, whether you realized you were a leader and how you kind of came to the point that you're at right now.
So if you ask my mom this question, she would tell you that like around 2-3 years old, I told her that she was not the boss of me. So I pretty much came out of the womb deciding that this world was going to be mine and I was going to rule it. But, in truth, from a very early age, that is true. I was the kid where my mom would say, she read all the parenting books and she would say, oh, do you want the blue shirt or the red shirt? And I was like, well, how about the green one? Like, I've always kind of challenged authority. I've always, looked for leadership positions, but I've also been a very, I kind of consider myself a diplomatic leader, though. I would be like in school project groups. And even if I wasn't the leader of the group, I was the one that was asking the leading questions, like, how do we get there? so that the whole group would do well. And my leadership, my belief is, we lead better from within than ahead or above. And so I would rather be part of the fold and moving than necessarily driving the train. So because of that philosophy, yeah, I've just kind of always found myself in leadership positions, even when I've never had the title of leader. And so I did that all the way through school and college. And then in the workforce, I worked for a large international retailer and I worked in their management. I opened stores, trained new leaders, and spent a lot of time learning that. That was probably the time in my life where my passion for developing female leaders really began to take hold, because in the secular world and where I worked, my gifts were very much appreciated and they were very fostered, and they were happy to recognize what they had and move that ahead as quickly as possible. I've also seen how that translated into the ministry world, which is not as necessarily eager to grab you and move you forward. And depending on your denomination and your culture and where you even live, the stained glass ceiling sits at different levels. And so that's really kind of continued where my ministry, my calling is in developing women as leaders, because I just see the need for it. And I want to be supportive and I want to encourage women. And I live in a place of, I always want the people that I'm pouring into to surpass me one day. I'm not trying to stay ahead of them. I'm trying to pave a way for you so that you don't have to get as bumped and bruised as I did on the way, and where you can find success for the generations coming up behind me. It's hard, but that's kind of where my leadership journey has taken me. I have days where I finally understand what the Bible says when they're like, oh, he ripped at his clothing and, he tore out his clothes and he cried out to the Lord. I was like, I didn't get that at first. I was like, why would you rip your clothes? Until I actually found myself in my hallway, grabbing my shirt and pulling it because I was so aggrieved for what I was seeing at that particular time amongst leadership. So now I've doubled down more, and I'm very fortunate that I have a husband who supports that and pushes me when I feel that kind of despair of leadership, and says, no, you keep pushing forward because there are other people coming up behind you. So that's kind of my journey and where I'm at and where I'm continuing to push through. And it's so much fun.
I love it. So Gena, I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned your transition from the marketplace into the church world and how that kind of the different experience that you've had in those two places in terms of leadership development. I'd love for you to share just a little bit more about what that transition was like and maybe some of the lessons you've learned in that process.
Yeah, so it's sort of like a crazy place because like you hear people talk about, oh, there's not so many opportunities for women in the marketplace and they're still fighting and they're still whatever. And I'm sitting here going, no, I've been in both. And trust me, you have way more opportunities and it's much easier for you in the marketplace than it's going to be in the church. And that's a sad truth. Well, I'm going to talk about that in a second. But to get back to the first question is that transition was really hard because in the marketplace, companies have clear-cut policies. You have policy manuals. If you are in a company where maybe you start at an entry-level position, you grow up in the culture of that company. You know the vision where it's going. You know the direction. You know where it's been. You know what the expectations are. And there's always something that you can kind of fall back to that says, here's the processes on how we do everything. And in the church, especially unless you're in like a mega church, which has had somebody who's come in and really worked through that for you, in the smaller churches, so much of it is fly by the seat of your pants on any given day. And there aren't policy manuals and there isn't a human resources officer and there isn't somebody who you can go to help you navigate some of the red tape and some of the issues that you're going to present. And so that was a really weird transition, as well as those policy manuals are there to help you succeed. And they want to address anything that could potentially come your way so that you're prepared. You know what? When I became a small group leader, nobody prepared me for the midnight call from a woman in crisis. Nobody prepared me with how to deal with a woman who calls you and she's drunk or she's, under the influence of drugs or she's suicidal or that's a whole nother emotional element that you don't necessarily see in the marketplace, because those kind of calls are reserved for friends, not your manager, because your manager might fire you. Right. You're not getting fired necessarily from your church. And so it's a much more emotional connection. And I wasn't prepared for that. And I didn't know how to navigate those waters. I think that's why it's so important to me now to develop leaders and to create these systems in place. I can maybe even feel a little too systems heavy sometimes to pastors, but that's because I've walked those roads. But some of the lessons that I learned, and this was probably the hardest one and probably the one I talk about the most, is, when you're in the marketplace, there is a protocol for everything, right? So, if you're middle management and somebody who's below you has a problem with something that's going on in upper management, they come to you, you go to your boss, they go to their boss, and that continues until you get to that point where a resolution has been found. And that chain of command is something that we are taught at a very early age. We're taught that when we're in school, if you have a problem, you go to your teacher and your teacher handles it. And if they can't handle it, then the vice principal and then the principal and the school board. We kind of know that already. Then we go into the marketplace and that's confirmed that that's how you do it. Well, when you transition into church leadership and you're in the middle, it's an entirely different world because the expectation is what I like to call the Matthew conflict resolution solution, right? And that's where everybody goes to. This is how we handle conflict resolution. It's outlined in Matthew. You go to the person who you have the problem with, and if that doesn't solve, then you bring 2 or 3 with you. And then if that's not resolved, you go to the pastor. And then if that's not resolved, then it goes before the entire church. And that is great and wonderful when you're talking about conflict resolution. If, say, I'm gossiping about somebody, I am cheating on my husband and somebody knows it, if I stole something, those are those really like one-on-one personal issues. But when the problem exists with something that's happening in the leadership structure of the church or the vision or the plan of the church, the pastor's expectation is the person with the problem is going to go right to them. And when that doesn't happen, they can get their feathers ruffled a little bit and they forget that the people have been trained to a chain of command protocol. And so they're doing what they see is right, which is I'm going to go to the person and, that's my small group leader, who will then go to the small group director, who will then go to that's their expectation. And the pastors don't see that in the same light. They want them to come directly to them. And when that doesn't happen, it can get really messy for the leaders that are stuck in between. And a little while ago, I kind of had this epiphany moment where I realized, a lot of pastors, they go to college, they get called into ministry, they go to, seminary, they come out of seminary and they go right into pastoring somewhere. They've actually never had to exist in corporate management. And so for them, this is the obvious direction is that, Matthew conflict resolution solution. But for those of us who have been living in the world and working in the world, we see a chain of command still. And that's an area where we've done a really poor job of helping people who are going into ministry leadership to understand. And this is where policy manuals and things like that are so wonderful. Yes, I'm a type A personality, if you haven't figured that out. I'm an Enneagram 8. I'm a INFJ. I'm all of those things that make me crazy. But this is where those kind of things actually can help us resolve those problems when we set clear communication of how we want these individual things handled versus just broadcasting of everything is going to be that Matthew conflict resolution. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned in this process that I wish I could go back and do differently.
Oh my goodness. I feel like I could talk to you about this all day long.
I could talk about this all day long.
So I guess one of the big questions that sort of comes out for me as I hear you talking about that is, I guess if you could kind of talk to the leader, the female leader that's in a church with a pastor who doesn't see the value in that, and not necessarily that that person would, sort of change everything, but could you speak to that person and how they could kind of start introducing these ideas and start introducing that sort of culture of having more of an organized format? Because I really feel like that can be, when you're used to that and when you sort of know how that goes, it can be very stifling and really make you feel really stuck if you don't really know how to go about that. So yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective.
That's a really important question too, just because we know that, everybody likes to talk about like the people that we're losing from the church, right? The millennials aren't coming back, or, we're losing this particular demographic. But really some recent studies have shown that one of our largest exoduses from the church is what they're labeling as the duns. And the duns are people who have been long-term committed, tithing, serving people who feel stifled in the church. They have tried to stay and pray for as long as they can for change, and ultimately were led that the only way they were going to be able to be obedient to their calling by God, which they feel, obviously is obedience to God trumps what the church expectation is. These are the people who are leaving. We're losing our best and our brightest because they have these gifts and these talents and these thoughts, and they're feeling stifled in their church and unable to use them. And so the question is, how do we resolve that? And that's really what you're asking. And it's so much easier when you're a guy, because you can go into your pastor and you can be like, bro, right? Because you can call your pastor bro if you're a guy. You can be like, bro, I see a problem here. And I got a solution, they can have that. But if a woman comes in and says, bro, we got a problem here, she's labeled a Jezebel, and, nobody ever wants to talk to her again. And she has to sit in the back row. And okay. So I deflect with humor. Sorry.
I was just sorry. I'm loving it. It's cracking me up.
You should really see me in a crisis. It's crazy. But that's the truth. It is much harder for a woman to come in and be that blunt. But at the same time, for my personality type, that's also really hard, especially being somebody who came out of the marketplace where I was allowed to be that way. And so for years, I've actually walked through those roads of not feeling affirmed in my church, not feeling supported, not seeing that my gifts were noticed, because I've been in the church for a long time. I remember going to woman after woman after woman who had these positions in their churches where they were affirmed and they felt seen and valued, and saying, how do I change this narrative in my church? How do I make a difference in my church? How do I get the pastor to stop seeing things in these particular, lenses, because the lenses have changed? And over and over again, I would get the same exact answer: submit to the authority and pray. How long can you submit to the authority and pray before you feel like you're dying inside? Before you catch yourself in your hallway, tearing at your clothes, going, God, open their eyes and let them see. There was a woman who I'd gone to, and for the situation I was in, and I said, I really feel like I might have to actually leave this church, because there is no area here. There's no space that's been created that this is a safe space for me to be able to go to the leadership and to talk about this honestly. They don't want to hear it. And so one is, we have to recognize that those spaces exist. There are spaces that exist that you unfortunately will not be able to change. Only the Lord is going to be able to change their hearts. And you can pray for them and not be among them. And I think that's key. And while I am no longer part of that church, I still pray for that church every single day, that the Lord would change the hearts of the leadership of that church to see the valuable women that are sitting inside of their church. But I had gone to this one woman, and she said to me, oh, Gena, she said, the Lord won't move you there until he has somewhere for you to go. Right. And so I stayed there too long. And when I stayed there too long, what began to creep up in me was a spirit of bitterness and criticism. And I did not like whom I was becoming. And that had to stop. And one of the good things that we know biblically is what that woman had advised me at the time, which seemed at the time reasonable and true, isn't actually biblical. Look how long the Israelites had to wander in the desert before they could get to the promised land because of what God had to do in the interim. And so for myself, I had to have a wandering in the desert period where I was not in that church anymore. I was still communing with God. That hadn't changed my relationship with God. And I think if I would have stayed, it could have impacted my relationship with God. But to preserve my relationship with God, I had to wander in the wilderness for a little while until he showed me a place where I could go and where my gifts and my values were going to be seen and affirmed and wanted and desired. And that the second I walked in there, I didn't feel like I had to be quiet. I could actually speak up and I could talk. And I had the pastor's wife actually say to me, I've been praying for someone like you. And so we have to be willing to move. We have to be willing to let go. We have to be willing to say, you know what, as much as I've got, 13 something years dedicated to this church, there may be a place that God's calling me to serve. Also, it might be that your gifts and your gifts and talents are maybe not actually intended for that church. It may be that God has somewhere in the community he wants you to use those gifts and talents. And that's where you have to have a very personal relationship with God, where you are praying regularly about this for God and the Holy Spirit to come in, guide you to where those gifts are supposed to be used. And it may be that once you find that those gifts and talents are being used in an organization, maybe it's a nonprofit, a community ministry, something like that, where God's using those things there, that the stifling in your church isn't quite so stifling anymore. I have a really bad habit of feeling like everything that I'm doing has to be under the authority of my church and under the authority of my pastors and done in the church. And sometimes we are called to go out. Sometimes, it's sort of like I was talking to a friend and I said, there's that scripture about being the city on the hill and you have the light and people come and find you. Yes, sometimes you're meant to be the light that's posted for people to come and find, but sometimes you're meant to grab the lantern and go out. And you have to go out and you have to seek the people and you have to meet them where they're at. And that's just where some of us are called. And so by being in the Word, by having a prayer life, by really seeking the Holy Spirit's guidance, you can determine, am I in a stage of stay and pray, or am I in a stage of go to grow? And those are the two places where I think he's going to take you one way or another. He's not going to leave you in limbo, but it's going to be hard. It's going to hurt. And we have to own that. We can't dismiss that. And too often we try to dismiss that. And that's just the process. And perhaps you are not ever going to be the woman who achieves that leadership position in your church, but you may pave the way for the one who will. And so wherever we go, whatever we do, and however God moves us, it is important that what we leave is a good taste in the mouth of the leadership of who we are as a woman, as a leader. And there are ways, it would be great if I could walk in, I could be like, yo, man, I got a problem, but I can't. But I can come in and I can say, this is how I feel. This is what my concerns are. And this is how I would like to grow here. And here's how I think I can serve. And honestly, you're going to tell really quickly by how they respond to you, how receptive they are to that. And if there is a reason to stay and pray, or if you're actually getting the signs that, no, it's actually time for me to go so that I can grow. But I know that doesn't sound really hopeful. It's sad sometimes to even think that way. But, honestly, the truth is we're still in that time period of transition and change.
Yeah.
And so we kind of have to accept that that's where we are. And how are we going to be a part of moving it forward? What will that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I just loved what you just shared there. I feel like it's so helpful for so many women. And I think there's probably a lot of women who are in that boat of feeling like their gifts and their talents are not recognized. And like we talked about on the episode with Katie Cole, I think that whatever theological standpoint you fall in on the range of where, women in leadership, I think we all still want to play a role in what's happening at our church, and to feel like you're unneeded or that your gifts aren't recognized. That's not a fun place for any of us to be. So
no, not at all.
I appreciate your perspective on that. And I'm curious, like in these churches, in the two different churches you've been involved in that you were referring to, were you in a role of a staff position or a volunteer position? Like what has been your kind of roles in the church at this point?
Oh, Lordy, Lordy, Lordy. I am a lifetime committed full-time volunteer. Honestly, in the denomination that I'm in, full-time staff positions for women are a very, very rare thing. They're usually more found as the church becomes a larger church where there are more non-pastoral roles available for women, where, they're looking for people who can be team leaders. Like, for example, maybe she oversees the complete next step program of how are we, meeting and greeting our new members? How are we following up with them? We've got 15,000 people coming to our church. So we need somebody in a full-time staff position over that. And that's one for women. And I'll tell you, it is hard to be in that conservative of a denomination for someone like me. I would love to get paid. I'll be honest with you. I would love to have a job where I get paid for the 40 hours a week that I put in ministry service, for sure. My husband would love it even more. But it's a part of being committed to being in the process of that change. If I leave and I go somewhere where I can get a job, and trust me, I've tried. I've got 20 years of women's ministry experience. I've got a degree. I've written a book on women's ministry. Trust me, there's probably a non-denominational church out there that's really, ready to hire somebody with all of my stuff. I've put in for the job. For some reason, God won't let me get it. I don't know why, other than I'm supposed to be here as an agent of change. And so I kind of accepted that role, that this is going to be how I function in this space, is to create something new. And I'm very fortunate. You mentioned Katie Cole. I know Katie. She and I are a part of actually the same church.
Oh.
We're just on different campuses. So I'm very fortunate to be in one where those changes are beginning to happen, and more room is happening and more space is being made, and where the staff recognizes what the women are contributing and they're opening up more space for women. But it's just, I wish I could be staff. I wish I would love it. But at the same time, a friend of mine says, but Gena, if you get tied down to be a staff position, then everything that you're going to do outside of the church will pay a price. And which is more important to you? And ultimately, God always keeps coming back and saying, what you're doing outside of the church right now is more important than getting a paycheck from the church. And I'm hoping that one day more women will be able to get a paycheck in the church from my denomination, because of the work we're doing now. But it's a weird state that we're in too. So I picked up this book. It's a youth book, and it's called Our Struggle to Serve: The Stories of 15 Evangelical Women, right? And I was like, ooh, this sounds great. I get it home. I opened up the cover just out of curiosity. I was like, when was this written? Because I got it. And I was like, wow, this looks like an older book than I thought it was, because I ordered it online. It was written in 1979. And the stories that are accounted in there go all the way back to 1950. And as I'm reading through this book and I'm hearing these women's struggles and their perspectives, I have these moments of pause where I go, wow, not much has changed. Mm. We haven't made the ground that we should have made when you're considering we are 50 years later. At the same time, I do get these glimpses of hope, though, that say, but we haven't given up the fight yet. And we haven't given up the hope yet. And there are places where we have made some grounds. And that makes it easier to go, okay, I will continue to be a full-time volunteer, potentially to the day that I die, if that means that I've created space for someone else another day. Let her get her time on the platform. Let her get her recognition. I don't care if that's on the back of the hard work I had to do in the interim.
Oh, wow. Yep. I feel like sometimes that's all I can say is just, yep, you're hitting the nail right on the head. So
it got real heavy real quick.
Yeah. Let's dive in a little bit deeper into the volunteer leadership topic. I'd love to open that up a little bit with you. And one thing that we kind of notice is that leaders struggle with how to get their volunteer teams on board with projects and serving. And sometimes volunteer leaders are in a sticky spot between the church staff and their team members. So I'd love for you to kind of talk about what some best practices are that you have found to be helpful when it comes to the issue of volunteer leadership.
I think first, one of the problems that I've seen kind of universally is that there seems to be a lack of spiritual gifts testing in the church. Mm. And there's a bunch of different online sources for that. Some are free, some are paid. Generally, you get the same results from them. And so the first thing is that I just don't see it being done. To me, that should be part of your process, right? So they come to your church, they visit for the first time, they come for a little while, they decide to accept Christ in their heart. The next step you do is you baptize them, right? And then the next step after that should be a spiritual gifts test. We should be able to identify what is the gifting that God has given them. But then the second part of that is not just, okay, here's what your gift is. That's great. It's hospitality, it's administration, it's whatever. But then how do we employ that in the church? That then has to be the spot. There has to be somewhere for them to go. And in fact, most people will stay a longer committed member if they feel they have a place in the church where they belong and where they're needed, not just as being a warm seat. I think most people desire that. I think very few people really actually want to come and just be fed and leave. I think the majority of people actually want somewhere to belong. But what ends up happening is church leadership is more interested in filling the holes. Okay. And we all know children's ministry has the most holes of any ministry on the planet. And What we also know is that anybody who's been in the church long enough knows if I put my name on that list for children's ministry, I will be there till the day that I die. And there's assumptions. Like, people love to come to me. I remember we had moved and we had started this church in this new city, and I had been there like 2 Sundays. That was it. And here comes Karen with the clipboard, who was like, do you want to teach VBS? And I was like, first of all, you don't even know me. Like, you want to trust me with children? You don't even know who I am. But second of all, children's ministry isn't my calling, and it never has been my calling, right? So one day, many years later, I happened to walk in when a kind of impromptu staff meeting was happening, and they were talking about like staffing children's ministry volunteer positions. And they said, well, anybody who uses the children's ministry should have to volunteer at least, this many times per year. And I just piped up because, hi, this is me and this is what I do. And I said, well, then my kids will be sitting in service with me. I wasn't part of the meeting. I just said that as casually as I walked by, I was like, and they stopped me and they said, why? You're a mom. And I said, well, just because I'm a mom does not mean that I'm called to children's ministry. I'm a mom to my kids. God gifted me my kids. I love my kids. I can teach my kids. I can do all of that. But that doesn't mean that I have the gifting to work with other people's children, the patience for other people's children. And frankly, if I don't, you shouldn't want me in that position. And so too often our leadership is so interested in filling those holes that we stick people into them, almost like pegging a hole in a boat, and we leave it there because now that hole is plugged and I can go worry about the other holes that need to be plugged, where it may not be that that's what they were meant to do. And if it's not, eventually that plug's going to pop out and your boat's going to start sinking again. And you're going to be scrambling again. And so if we actually take the time to not only just spiritual gifts test them, but look at where that fits into the church versus what holes need to be filled in the church, we can plug them into different places. And generally speaking, I find if you can have somebody who's serving in their passion, they're happy to help you fill the holes when the holes need to be filled temporarily. But they need to know that there's an exit strategy for that I will not be here until the Lord comes back or takes me home. And so we need to have that. I will go and help in children's ministry if you need me for a couple of Sundays, or if somebody doesn't show up and you need somebody to go sit in the nursery, I can do that. And I'm happy to do that because the passion part of me, where God has called me, is being fulfilled already. And I'm happy to help where I can help. But we have to have exit strategies for those moments. We also need to really live in a Paul Timothy model where every leader that is in our church needs to be looking for and identifying future leaders and building them up. I used to call it my hit by a bus backup plan, because if I get hit by a bus, somebody needs to be able to come up and do that. And what was interesting is that I'm also friends with Karen Pryor, who was actually hit by a bus. And so I told her, I said, I had to stop using that analogy. And she said, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard. She's like, keep using it. It's fine. But you have to be in that moment of, what happens if something seriously happens in my life that pulls me from ministry in an instant? This isn't a transition out. It's an instant. Who's going to come in and who's going to lead this? And that comes from the volunteers that are working under you, that you have been developing them to come up and take your space, so that when you go, okay, this plug is ready to leave this hole in this boat, there's already somebody ready to go there, and your pastors don't have to worry about that. That creates a system of replenishing that we can actually work on, that keeps that church healthier. And people always feel like, if I no longer feel called to this area, I can go, because there's going to be somebody to come in. And that brings me to another point, which is too, we don't just one and done spiritual gifts testing. My spiritual gifts at 40 years old are not what they were when I was 20. So we need to go back and revisit those and go, is this still your gift? And is this still where you need to be serving? Or is there somewhere better that we can be utilizing you? So for volunteer retention, I think that's important. I think it's important to put people where they have their passions versus just filling holes. They're going to stay longer. They're going to serve better. Having exit strategies for them to get out if they no longer want to do it. And then for the other side of the question, from that kind of being in the middle, is you are going to be pressed, because the people who are serving under you, they have expectations, and the people who are overseeing you, they have expectations of you. And you are going to have moments where you feel like you are pressed between a vice, because you cannot satisfy both people. And that is the place where having good, clear communication between leadership is so important, that you can be able to come in and say, look, pastor, I'm feeling a lot of pressure here because of this change that's happened. Do you think you could come to our next team meeting and talk to them about why we've made these changes, what the vision is for the church, where God's calling us, and why it's important that we're doing it a little bit differently? And a lot of times, something just as simple as that can make a huge difference. I served on a women's ministry team at one time where they decided that we were going to go from having like a women's ministry event basically every month to just 2 times a year. And that sent the women's ministry team into panic. Are you shutting down the women's ministry? What does that mean? What does that look like for our women? They were really they were going crazy over it. My phone was ringing off the hook, And I went to the pastor and his wife and I said, look, they're freaking out. They feel like this is what's happening. Could you come in and talk to the women? And the answer was no.
Mm.
And I left that pause there because there was no explanation as to why he wouldn't. It was just, no, this is the vision. They're either for it or they're against it. Well, that created a big problem. And what we watched was people leave the church from it or step out of ministry service from it. And that was really sad. And in the end, we all learned a really tough lesson, including the pastor, because he lost a lot of people that had not only been serving in women's ministry, but serving elsewhere. And it just wasn't pretty. And so you have to be able to have that healthy environment where that pastor's willing to come in and give 30 minutes of his time to say, look, I know that change is hard. And I know that you may not like these policies, or these new directions we're going, but here's why. Bring them into the vision that the Lord has cast. Don't just tell them what the vision is. Bring them into it. Help them see it. Because if they can see it, they're going to get excited about it. And if they're excited about it, they're going to work their tails off to make it happen. And they will be there when you need them as volunteers. So there has to be some healthy communication there. Because if you don't have it, then forget it. You're just going to continue to feel pressed from both sides. And like if you took a balloon and you pressed it between your hands, eventually it's going to pop. And then you as that middle rung leader, you're going to end up either burnt out, hurt, wounded, and you will probably end up being the one who leaves. And if we want to avoid that, healthy communication is the easiest way.
Mm. Yeah. I love what you shared about the importance of the leadership sharing the vision, because I think that right there is so vital. Sometimes what I have seen is that at times leaders, and not just in the church, but in any organization, leaders, are making some decisions behind closed doors that will affect other people in other aspects of their organization or their ministry without getting any sort of conversation going between the two parties. And then they present this new idea, like they're on board with it because they've been talking about it for 6 months. But the people who it's affecting are hearing about it for the first time and they don't know what to do with it. And they feel sometimes like everything that they've been doing up to this point hasn't mattered because it's not been taken into account with that decision. So yeah. I think that idea of sharing the vision and even including the team members in some of those conversations is something for us as leaders, whether we're in a volunteer role or a paid role, to think about. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you shared with us, Gena, part of your leadership journey is that you have been a leader with a chronic illness. So I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about that and what that has looked like for you.
So I didn't always have one. There was a time I was healthy and everything in my body worked the way it was supposed to. My brain, my eyes, my hands, my energy was always there. And after I had my third daughter, I just did not recover from that pregnancy the way I had. Everybody comes at you and they're like, oh, well, you have 3 kids now. Well, we had kind of spaced our kids out, not intentionally, God had, but in a manner where I really only ever had one child home at a time. By the time the next child came, they were starting preschool or kindergarten. And so kind of really wasn't like, I wasn't like the mom with 4 kids under 4. Also, they're like, well, and you're older now. Well, by the time I had my third, because we started really young, by the time I had my third, I was still in my early 30s. Okay. So it wasn't like I was knocking on the door of 40 trying to raise a brand new baby, or like friends of mine who became like a mom again after 50, right? Like that was not my story. And I just knew that things were not the way that they should be. So it took a couple of years of talking to doctors and getting tests done before finally I was able to get a diagnosis. And so my diagnosis is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's a autoimmune disease that affects your thyroid. And if you know anything about your thyroid basically affects every other part of your body. And so you can have any number of 300 possible symptoms. No two people will have the same symptoms. My sister has the same disease. She was diagnosed right around the same time I was. That actually helped me get my diagnosis. And my sister and I have completely opposite symptoms. So even if you're from, in the same family, same genetic family, you may not have the same symptoms. And so it was really tough because I had trouble thinking clearly. I was forgetting things. My energy level was completely zapped. And it was a real struggle to just kind of get through the everyday life, let alone be a leader, because you have expectations on you. And so something always had to give. If I was busy leading something at the church, then that meant everything in my house just went. The house was a mess. The dishes weren't being done. On the flip side is if I was committed to my house, then everything at the church had to give, right? And it was just a really rough time. It took me years and years and years of then still working with doctors to try to figure out the best way to treat it and the best way to kind of just try to get my life back, right? And I have to say, I was really fortunate. I did not have anybody in my life who tried to tell me that the reason I was sick was because my faith wasn't strong enough. I had nobody who tried to tell me that if I would just pray a little bit harder, God would heal me. And I'm very thankful for that. But I really clung to the scripture about, I have got this thorn in my side. And 3 times I prayed to the Lord to take this from me. And he did not, so that in my weakness, he would be made strong. I clung to that. And I held on to that if the Lord was going to keep me sick, there was a reason for it, right? So fast forward, I do end up with a new doctor. I get a new treatment. I am on the upswing. I am feeling better. I actually was able to go back to seminary. I mean, I went to school. It was crazy, the testimony of how God has worked through that. But ultimately, every single time I come back to that and somebody says, how do you do all the things that you do? I say, nothing short of the Lord, because I know my body's still not well. And so if it was up to my body, I would be in bed and I would be sleeping when I'm not having to do the basic necessities for life. But the Lord gives me the strength to do the things that he's called me to. And it's also helped me to really learn as a leader to prioritize what is really important. It's made my no a little stronger. Because before I was the type to say, ooh, that's a really good thing and nobody's volunteering for it. Maybe I should go in and volunteer. And my husband would say, Gena, the Lord doesn't need you in everything. If you go in and answer that call, then maybe that person that he's putting it on their heart and trying to stir to service is not going to answer the call because somebody else has done it, or, you're taking someone else's blessing away. So that was kind of helpful too. My husband doesn't say a lot, but when he does, it's always very wise. Clearly I'm the talker in the family, but it really came into that everything that I do now is because that's what the Lord has called me to do. And he gives me the strength to do it. But, when you are a leader who is serving with a chronic illness, learning to have a strong no, learning to prioritize, learning to work more effectively on the days that you feel well is really important. You have no room for putting things off for another day. Deadlines can be crucial because at least it lets you know what you have to get done. But it also means I can't work up to the deadline. I really have to be ahead of the game. But it also has given me insight as a leader to the women who serve in our church, who serve under me, that they too, whether they have a chronic illness, somebody in their family has a chronic illness, or even what I would consider a temporary illness that somebody's dealing with just for a time, but it has the same impact in their life as a chronic illness would. It has given me the insight to how to help them be a part of ministry versus feeling excluded. My husband had surgery years ago, and I remember at that time, everybody wanted to take all my ministry work away from me because they didn't want me to be stressed out and they didn't want me to have all this stuff on my plate. And I said, no, I need that as an outlet. I need a place where I can kind of let go of all that's going on in our lives right now. So that taught me to never assume what somebody can and cannot do. Have conversations with them. If they want to be active, but they have these illnesses or these things in their lives that are potentially going to steal their time away or their energy, how can I include them in the ministry in a healthy way? That doesn't mean giving them pat busy work. That's not okay. What it does mean is I can give you the things that if at the end we don't get them done, it's okay. The event's not going to fall apart because we didn't do this one little thing. You give them plenty of notice. You don't spring on them at the last minute. You give them the tools and everything that they need. Let's say it's assembling something. You want to assemble care packages for somebody, and they say they want to do it, and you have a deadline that you want to do this for Christmas. You don't go to the person with chronic illness and give it to them the third week of December. You need to give it to them, actually probably at the beginning of November. So they have plenty of time to work through that and get that stuff done. They still feel a part of the church. They feel like they have ownership and involvement in the things that the church is doing. They feel like they are seen and valued, because a lot of people with chronic illness feel forgotten about. They feel discarded because people don't want to put anything on them or whatever. We have to still make those people feel valued and wanted, and that they have a place that they can serve in the church.
Oh, so good. But I think you answered all of my next question. So I'm still going to ask it in case there's something else that you wanted to say, but you've given us lots of really practical things to hang on to. So I'm wondering if you can tell us how churches and leaders can do a better job of understanding chronic illness. And I know you said a lot, but if there's anything else you can think of, we'd love to hear it.
I think the very first thing that I would say to leaders in churches is stop dismissing it just because you can't see it.
Yeah.
If you look at me, especially if I'm working in the zone, like I've got all my energy that day or whatever, you would have no idea that I was sick. None. My makeup, I do it well enough that you can't tell I have little bald patches in my eyebrows. If my skin is flaring up, I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt. We tend to hide those things, when you have an illness that has any sort of physical presentations. But at the same time, even on, days where those things aren't presenting, I'm still sick. That's never going to go away unless the Lord chooses to completely heal me. That's never going to go away. And so just because I sound healthy, just because I look healthy, doesn't necessarily mean that I am healthy. And what I've heard from a lot of people who have chronic illnesses and invisible illnesses, they will say things like, and this is going to blow people's mind when I say it, but they will say things like, I wish I had cancer. Think about that for a second. I wish I had cancer. Why? Because then I would have physical symptoms that people could see and they would take me more seriously. What we say to people that have chronic illness or have invisible illnesses is we say things to them like, well, if only you ate better. If only you exercised more. Girl, look, I was working out 6 days a week. I had a nutritionist. I had a personal trainer. I had a team of doctors working with me, and I was still putting on weight. It had nothing to do with what was going in my mouth. It had nothing to do with the number of calories I was burning. It had everything to do with the fact that my body was broken. My body is actively trying to kill my thyroid every single day, every day. And so we have to have compassion, and we have to acknowledge that these illnesses are real, that they exist, and that yet this person still has value. So we don't just write them off. And so the first thing I would say is, acknowledge it. Second is remember it. Don't forget it just because they look good today. And 3, don't discount them as somebody who can be a viable person in serving in your church in some capacity. Just have an open conversation with them. Instead of putting on them what you need them to do, you can ask them, what can you do? That's a great place to start.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it's helpful for us to just be keeping these things in mind. I mean, we talked about mental health recently. We were talking about, with you, your experiences. And I just think that the more we can have awareness of these issues, the better we're going to navigate leading people well. So I appreciate you sharing your experience. As we wrap up, we like to talk about the fact that leaders are learners. So we always love to hear something that you are learning or that you've been listening to lately that you would like to share with our audience.
Wow, there's so much information out there. There's never been a better time to learn than right now, because we have at our access like a plethora of information. So a couple of things that I'm diving into right now. Every year, I actually read this book. It's called Church Refugees. It's by Josh Packard. And it is basically a book that talks about the Duns. Why are they leaving? I want to be constantly reminded as a church leader of this demographic of people who are leaving and why are they leaving, so that I can make sure that I'm not ignoring those people that I'm in charge of. So that's huge for me. I read it every year. I'm in the middle of going through it now. As I said earlier, I'm reading Our Struggle to Serve, The Stories of 15 Evangelical Women. That is by Virginia Hearn. That is a fantastic book. It's very eye-opening to how much change we have and haven't had. And so I wish it was still in publication. And who knows, maybe my follow-up book will be, We're Still Struggling. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see where the Lord leads me on that. But those are two great things. You know, I listen to your podcast. I tell people to listen to your podcast because we need more stuff out there that is specifically addressing the Christian woman who's leading. I love Katie Cole's podcast. I'm not biased because she's my friend. I heard about her book and was on the launch team of her book before I actually met her face to face. I was already a fan. That's a great book, Developing Female Leaders by Katie Cole. I would highly recommend that as something to read if you're a woman who is in leadership, trying to get into leadership, looking for some ways to affect how your church is addressing leadership for women. So I recommend that. And goodness gracious, just the world is your oyster. So go to the internet, look up some stuff. After the School podcast has a great series on women leading in the church. I highly recommend that.
I haven't heard of that.
It's like 8 episodes long. Like it's
called After the School?
After School podcast. After the School podcast.
Okay. All right. We'll put the link in the show notes. We'll find it.
Yeah. It's After the Class podcast. That's it. Gosh,
okay.
I'm so excited about it. But I read it. And I was like, wait, I kept hitting stop and I would write a note and then I'd hit play and stop and then play. It was like back in the old day when you would like have to try to record something off the radio, you know, and you're like, stop. And like I kept having to hit the button because like, that was profound. Ooh, I liked that. And what's really good about it, and you guys will understand why I say this, is that particular podcast is hosted by men who are addressing the role of women leading in the church from a very biblical perspective. And so they are going to get the ear of male pastors, unfortunately, far easier than I am. Even to the point where, like, when I wrote my book and the editor showed me like my first cover, I was like, oh, no pastor's going to walk around with that book. We're going to need to change that. You know, it has to be something that they're going to be willing to pick up and look at. And so that's a fantastic podcast. And if you're really interested, wherever you stand on the role of women serving in the church, whether you're a complementarian, egalitarian, somewhere in the middle, I think there's like soft versions of each. And listen to that podcast, because these guys are phenomenal in breaking it down into its bare parts. And it's all straight into the scripture with some historical stuff thrown in there. It's just a really, really good one. I would highly recommend it. Yeah, just, you know what, whatever that is that God's calling you to, just know there's a resource online that you can read that will talk about that will educate you on that. But make sure that you do it with discernment and that you're not just looking for the things that speak to the answer you want to receive, that you're looking at both sides of the equation. But those would be my top things that have kind of got me going right now that I would put in front of people. There's also a great book, I Am Leader by Angie Ward, that I recommend, and Worthy by Elise Fitzpatrick. That's a really good book too. Okay, I'm sorry. I read a lot.
We love it. We'll take all the suggestions. I can't guarantee that we'll get through them all, but I'm excited to check them out at least. So as we wrap up, we would love for you to share with our listeners the best way for them to connect with you. If you have anything you'd like to share with our audience, feel free to let us know.
Easiest way to connect with me is right through my website. So if you go to Gena B. McCown, so Gena, the letter B, MCCOWN. There are no extra vowels in there, .com. If you go there, you will find all the links to my social media. You will find the link to my blog, as well as some other information about me, how to contact me if you are interested in, having me come and speak or just for coaching. If you're a publisher and you're interested in maybe a book, go to the bottom of the page. My agent's there. Maybe we can talk about our book. Still struggling. But no, in all seriousness, that is the easiest way to get all of those links and find me. I kind of like to keep things in one place. It makes it just streamlined. And if there's anything I could say to people right now, if you're leading, if you are still in, like, if we're, I don't know, when this airs, if we're still in the craziness of COVID, if we're, or some other crisis or other, whatever's going on, you may feel like at times that you are treading water, right? That you're just kind of right there. You're not making any moment. It is really easy to let a treading water moment turn into a quicksand moment and you're stuck. So the best advice that I can give to anybody, it's okay to recognize you're treading water, that you're just surviving right now, but choose to find some direction, look for the shore, try to figure out where you're going and make some small steps to get there. Don't allow yourselves to get stuck in the quicksand.
Love it, Gena.
So good.
Thank you so much for taking the time with us today. And I just can't wait for everybody to hear this. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Hi, friend. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. We're so glad you took the time out of your day to listen, and I truly hope that it made an impact on your ability to lead well. If it did, would you consider sharing this episode with a friend? You could take a screenshot of the episode and share it on your social media, maybe an Instagram story or on Facebook, or you could just text the link to a friend. We would truly appreciate that, as when you share with a friend, it helps spread the word about the podcast and it helps more women to be able to be impacted so that they can lead and love others well. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.